was serving on the Democrats Abroad Mexico National Board. Democrats Abroad is regarded by the Democratic National Committee as the 51st state. They just don't realize we live all over the world, and that to me, we have to travel all over the world. So they're very committed Democrats who end up being in Democrats Abroad, especially as officers. Our previous forums have been, first of all, on medical issues for expats who are living here, and then last month we had a forum on money and politics, the rise of the oligarchy in the United States and its intersection with politics. So very committed people came to that one. This is more related to things that both Canadians and Americans would be interested in, and it has to do with both sides of the immigration issue. If you're coming into Mexico, what do you need to do if you're going to be establishing residence here? And then we'll also be dealing with immigration matters for those going north from here and south. The purpose of Democrats Abroad really is to help in voter information and education, but also, very importantly, to help you vote if you happen to be living abroad during the time that either your primary or the general election takes place. In addition, we will be having a global primary here in Puerto Vallarta. Actually, you could vote in it now if you were already a member. But if you would rather have some help in that vote, we will have set-up booths in front of the IFC on the plaza there between the IFC and the school for language school. We'll set up some tables there, and we'll help you vote on March 3rd and March 1st. So March 1st and 3rd, we will be there in legions to help you vote. And if you want that help, we're very happy to give it. Also, as I said, you can vote right now on your computer if you have a scanner and can then scan your ballot and send it back. For those of you who are intending to vote in the Democratic Global Primary, you will have to bring proof of residence here in Mexico as well as a passport. You can sign up for Democrats Abroad that day if you have those two items as well, because you do have to be a member to vote in the global primary, and only vote in that global primary and not for president in your own state primary as well. We can also help you get ballots from your state primary if it comes in time. So we can talk to you about that afterwards if you'd like, or the days that we're going to be setting up at the IFC. Now next month on March 8th, we're going to have a forum really related to having difficult conversations with people who don't agree with you politically. And that's going to be for Democrats Abroad members only. You're not restricted, obviously, but this is, how to have those difficult conversations. It's going to be led by our own John Wilson Bugby, who's had a passion about this issue for a long time. Because there are a lot of things as Americans we have in common that we seem to forget when we get on different sides of a political issue. So, today's topic, immigration. We're going to talk first, our Dan Grippo, our illustrious own Dan Grippo, is going to talk first. He first visited Mexico in 1980. He seems like he's always been here, and he's certainly a stalwart lecturer on Latin American and Mexican politics. He holds an MA in Latin American Studies and a PhD in Latin American History from the University of Kansas. He's traveled extensively in Mexico and settled in Puerto Vallarta in 2004. He's worked with us before in addressing immigration issues, and he's a part of building bridges instead of walls, the U.S. relationship with Mexico. So Dan's going to speak first about the current state of immigration law in the United States and also executive actions that have been decided outside of the legislation and some pending legislation. Now, on the other side of that, for those of you who are dealing with finding residency here in Mexico, Mr. Senior Felix Zarate is here. He's a immigration lawyer who's been practicing law in the Bahia de Banderas for over 26 years and is an active member of the Puerto Vallarta Lawyers Association. And his law practice covers the entire Bahia de Banderas with a concentration on immigration, civil law, and real estate. We're going to go first with Senor Grippo. Okay.
Muchas gracias, señorita Toby. It's great to be here. It's wonderful to see so many people caring so much about an issue that is so important. Now, my perspective is I tend to come from things historically as much as possible, but I'm going to minimize the history lecture part. It's really not going to go into much detail on that, other than to say we need to know the history, and I think most of you do. It's maybe preaching to the choir to say I think all of you know that what we call the Southwest U.S. was part of Mexico before it was part of the U.S. It was part of the Spanish Empire before that, and it was indigenous before that. So the only people with a real claim on this would be the indigenous Americans. And even they came over, it was 30,000 years ago, so maybe they should be granted some leeway for that, some recognition. But certainly, up until 1848, this was Mexico, and the reason, not this being here, but the Southwest. Reason being because that's where most of the migration to the U.S. is for, and that's, I believe, what I've been asked to speak a little bit about the perspective of the U.S. law system. But just to emphasize it, there's a lot of historical roots in the Southwest, and a lot of cross-border identity. In other words, we've imposed borders, we being the nations involved, and those borders shift, and that's how the world works. But identities are often cross borders and regions. And in many ways, Puerto Vallarta is a border town, if you think about it. It's a cultural border town where we constantly interflow English, Spanish, pesos, dollars. Your way of looking at it and mine, I'm sure you've run into that. So let's just be aware of the historical roots of all this. And one of the things that came out of the war with Mexico in 1846, 1848 was the question of land rights and titles that the Mexicans had at the time that the nation of Mexico had to cede basically what was half of its territory to the U.S. By losing that war. The Mexicans were promised U.S. citizenship and that their land rights would be respected. However, a lot of their titles were written in Spanish and with drawings of borders that were kind of geographic, and the U.S. People would come into those regions and take them to court over that, and because of the language issue and all that, they really Mexicans lost a lot of their rightful land at that time too. Then you follow economic boom and bust is basically the model to think about for how migration has actually worked. Can you all hear me? Is the
Very good.
Okay. So just World War I, World War II, World War I, Depression, World War II. You can kind of guess when immigration was high and when it was low. Was when labor was needed during the wars. Suddenly people could cross the borders without too much trouble. In between wars, when the Depression hits, people are kicked out. And actually, Decade of Betrayal is a book I would recommend. It's the 1930s in the U.S. and it's a shocking time where millions of Mexicans, many who are citizens, 60% were citizens, were summarily sent out of the country in municipalities all over, especially the Southwest, especially California, put on trains, given train tickets and told to be at the station, said, well, if you stay, your job is probably not going to last, veiled threats and the like, families split up. Very sad time. Then World War II comes around, we need workers, the Bracero program starts. That's from Brasso, which means arm. We needed workers to replace all the soldiers. So for 20 years, that was sort of a worker permit program with a lot of abuses, such as forced savings accounts where Mexicans were told that a portion of their income or their earnings would be in Mexican banks waiting for them. It would be deposited there so that when they were done, they could go back home and start, and the money wasn't there. They never got the money, most of those Braceros. A lot of abuses there. Bracero's program ended in 1965, and the United Farm Workers rose up, and I think most of us remember that time, and it was a time actually for once where the workers were able to organize a lot of the farm workers, and that was not only Mexicans but Filipinos were very involved in that. But starting in the 80s, that began to change, and there was the movement to criminalize immigration, and that's basically the model that I think is active now. It's the criminalization of migration. It's the criminalization of people moving desperately looking for work, basically, which is what, actually Mexican migrants work at a higher percentage in the U.S. population than U.S. people. In other words, if you look at all the Mexican migrants, like 75% of them have paid working jobs, whereas 63% of us native-born gringos have jobs. In other words, they're working at a higher rate, and they're basically here to work. But that's been criminalized, and people claim that maybe they're taking work from other people, but studies have shown that that's actually not been the case, and that a lot of those jobs go begging, and are going begging right now in the construction industry and fruit picking. There's a shortage, so you have to ask who profits from the system. That's one question I just throw out there, because systems, especially stagnant systems, and basically our immigration program in the U.S. has been stagnant in terms of legal, changes since the 1990s. There have been attempts made to redress it, but starting in the 80s, there was penalties applied to employer sanctions, and now that's been used lately for a lot of raids in the last 3 or 4, 6 years, even under the Obama administration. Before the executive orders that I'll talk about, there was a period of pretty high deportations, 400,000 a year. And a lot of people have been arrested and incarcerated for the crime of using a false social security number. And I just wanted to say a word about that and make sure everyone understands what that crime really is. You have to have a social security number to work, so you provide one, people buy them, they borrow them, they're false numbers so they can get a job. What does that mean? It means a certain portion of money is kept out of their check, sent into the Social Security Administration, and it's put in what's called a suspense file, which now has $50 billion in it. And that money is used to pay out current beneficiaries, current retirees. Those people will never see the money, and that's the crime that they can be arrested and jailed, and they are being jailed in large numbers. So that's the kind of criminalization going on. Since 2001, we've also lived in the national security state in the U.S. And even within the Homeland Security budget, the largest amount of money by far is going to immigration enforcement. So this has become, the border fence and all this, it's been very militarized in the last 15 years. So I just call your attention to that trend. Family connections, they used to be sort of an important part of immigration preferences, that if you had family, you wanted to bring in family, you had family ties, that could help you. The current wait time for a Mexican family in the U.S., citizen family, to bring in an adult child from Mexico, 22 years. So, minor, I don't know, but I know a lot of people have waited a long time and to try to do that. The backlog, it's basically a dysfunctional system in terms of, the number of visas is so restricted. Even some of the legal work programs for people who don't have, a skill or a lot of money. If you have, by the way, if you have $500,000, you can come in, this week. If you start a business with, an investment, and it's not just the U.S. that does that. Canada is the same around the world. So I'm not saying that you can see the logic of that, but underneath that logic, you also see the logic of the way things work under undocumented migration, because it works for a reason. It's an economic system that benefits a few people, and so we should be aware of that, and I think most of us probably are. David Bacon I want to hold up, and I have an interview with him I want to show you on, he wrote Illegal People, the age of globalization and the criminalization of immigration. In other words, he's tying the whole globalization, starting with, you can go back to NAFTA and see what that did, forcing, corn sellers could no longer sell their corn, in Mexico because they couldn't compete with Cargill and all these companies that have massive subsidies to sell their corn in Mexico to kind of dump it there. So where do those people go from, Oaxaca and all that? They end up migrating up to the U.S. So that's globalization, and then the other side is to criminalize those people, so you keep them undocumented, you keep them underpaid, unable to organize, of course, because if they do, they're punished. That's my quick summary. Don't mean to be too depressing about it, but what has, then President Obama, after, seeing the gridlock, he did sign 2 executive orders in 2014 after Congress was unwilling to, pass any common sense legislation reform. One was effective delaying deportations for millions of parents who have young people in the country. The young people could not be deported, and then families that had children born here, the adults were. The idea was to keep the families together, basically, to put a halt to that. Of course, that was challenged immediately by 26 Republican states run by Republican governors. It's been tied up, and now the Supreme Court is going to rule on it this summer. So basically, that has not been, those executive orders have not been enforced or put into action, which means that deportations continue. The President order was blocked last February after the lawsuit was filed by the Republican states. So we'll see how that comes out in the summer. I'm not too optimistic it'll be upheld, but we'll see. But needless to say, I wanted to give you about a 12-minute interview with David Bacon on that executive orders, and he gives a brief background. You can also just Google David Bacon and Illegal People, the title of his book, and you'll see an hour-and-a-half talk he gave in Portland a couple of years ago that really is an eye-opener. I mean, I think of all the people writing on this, he kind of pulls back the veil, for me anyway, beyond all the back and forth and people saying, well, the posturing, well, we have to, secure the borders first, and, that kind of language. It just veils, how this really works with people on the ground. So we'll listen to the David Bacon interview, and then the last slide I have after that, that's about a 12-minute YouTube. And then there's a slide of the positions of all the candidates running for president on kind of 5 basic questions. You can take a look at that, and that'll close my time.